In this video, I am going to talk about training of actions, and I'm going to talk about it through the lens of where I have been in powers in my previous game, and how I've slowly developed them into the current version of cards that we're going to be using in the upcoming release. So to begin with, I've opened up my 5.0 version of the base game. So I can kind of describe to you the way the powers used to work and the kind of problems that led to the creation of the cards. So to use an example of hydrokinesis is of course water magic. The way that the original game would operate was we had these powers, which could be unlocked at various levels. It was still a leveling mechanic. The powers themselves would be written in such a way that they would refer to some sort of baseline actions. So in this case, we have a ball, beam, cone, burst, column, wall, and sphere that are available in the base game effect of hydrokinesis. Later on, of course, through feats that you can acquire more action types. And so with the assignment of various feats, you could unlock more as you went through. This was part of the progression mechanic. But generally, it was that hydrokinesis would have some sort of baseline damage. So it actually afflicted the condition drench. And that most of the actions that were available were specified through the game effects. But the description for each of those powers and abilities was not readily available on the power itself. For that, you would have to go up to the actions area and find the appropriate power actions. So ball, beam, cone, these kinds of actions here. So to use these as kind of an example of what not to do, with this progression system, it was streamlined down from the original version, which took the ball, beam, cone, and all that kind of stuff, and then replicated it many times over on many pages in many different locations. And so players would be writing down large blocks of text whenever they wanted to add a new power or ability. And sometimes when they added a power or ability, it would add ball, beam, cone, burst, and column, which ended up meaning that they were copying over all this. So rather than that, most players would go in, they would put a little note in there about what page number to reference, and then they would go back to that when they wanted to take the action. Well, as I've mentioned, I don't particularly like the idea of returning to game books. So I aggregated the actions into this field where we have melee, range, power, physical, opportunity, etc. And so this made a shorthand way that they could immediately transition stuff over to the sheets. And then I could print out fast reference sheets that had power actions, physical actions, melee, whatever. The necessary element to be able to unlock whether or not you actually had an action of a specific type wasn't linked solely to the power. You would separately get a skill like thaumaturgy that would allow you to unlock the various stages. So everybody would have the kind of basic power actions to start with. You would have to have 1 rank in thaumaturgy to be able to use the next 3, the 4th rank to use the next 3, the advanced 3. And then the final one would be only available to somebody who had a +8 proficiency in a power. So this is the way that it did work, but there was really no stopping people from going back and referring to information on a sheet. And furthermore, because the information was buried on the sheet, and separately the information for things like range, reach, or proficiency, or turn duration for the condition drench, were all based on the character sheet. It meant that there was 2 points of reference as we were going through combat, and so players would go through, and their analysis of the current game situation would usually involve taking in the encounter, looking back at their thing, deciding whether or not they wanted to do that, going over here, checking to see what it does, going back here, seeing what the values were, then checking. So you had 1, 2, 3 interface points before you went back to the game board. I want to eliminate that with the digital sheets by aggregating it all in such a way that it all comes flat right there in one spot. So when you go down and look, you're only seeing just the one power, and using that as your point of reference for what it is that you're going to do. But I also didn't like how these components were disparate. I didn't like replication of these things happening over and over and over. So I decided what I wanted to do was to pursue cards, and to use cards as a way to ultimately make it possible for people to build their own actions, their own powers, their own magic, which I felt was already kind of embedded in the system. It just wasn't expressed in such a way that players could craft the actions themselves. So my first thought was to use a component-based system that was referencing things out of the player's handbook. Ultimately, I decided against this, and I went with cards. So why cards? Well, cards create crafting experience that's as visual as it is semantic. The process of moving cards around to find synergies is considerably more intuitive than finding blocks of text and matching them up. You're able to move things around in a more visual way to connect things together, and without having to flip pages in a book to find what it is that you're looking for or to make a reference. That would require the player's user experience to take in the action, remember how the action works, flip to the next page, and then look through all the options. In this case, being able to extract the card, place the card on the table, and then immediately go over to another set of cards and then match, you create a semantic visual representation of the power that you're trying to create. And I think that's a more efficient way of doing it. And I think it's also a more intuitive way of doing it. It also makes the power crafting system so that it doesn't prohibit an index-based approach. So there's nothing that says that cards need to be the only way that we interface with the system. There could still be an index in a book. So the presence of cards doesn't prohibit the existence of an index in a player's handbook if what players want is a traditional analog approach to the game. So, and then of course, there's more practical ways for people to support the product as they want to expand things. It's easier to drop cards into the game mechanic than it is to issue books. It will reduce the overall cost because it's the same format all the time. And printing and binding is considerably more expensive. So there are going to be 10 card types that are available. I think I've actually already done some process of eliminating some of these card types, so you have to bear with me. But we have action cards. The action cards are the standard form of action. They represent what the action is. There is a technique card. A technique card modifies the action. It changes the way the action works. There's an opportunity card, which when attached to an action, will give it a trigger mechanism so that it can happen outside of turn order. There's a power card, and a power card essentially is the kind of effect, whether it's hydrokinesis or pyrokinesis, the kind of damage that's being dealt. There is an object card. So if you're using pyrokinesis, you would drop flame on the area where the fire fell, right? So this is a persistent in-game object, and this is another form of card. Then we have skills. So skills are what I think Magic would call instants, meaning that they can be played at any time as a free action. Then we have augments. I'm not sure if augments should be tied in with powers because they function a little bit differently. But augments are temporary or active conditions of power. So to think of like a condition card, which is actually another one of the card classes, the final card class. A condition card is something like burn or bleed. So if you have a condition on you, burn or bleed, then you are, either losing hit points or you're suffering some form of like max hit point damage or something along those lines. But with an augment, you could see something as being like an active or persistent effect that doesn't necessarily always come into play. So, there's a degree of choice in it. And an example would be if you empowered or augmented your weapon with a burn condition, you would have to have a fixed number of charges on it, but the burn condition doesn't like tick down over time the way that a condition might. Like if a condition only lasts 13 turns, then you're tracking the number of turns of that condition. But with an augment, you may only use part of it in the first. You may not use it in your second turn. You may use it a little in your third. So it allows you to spread a condition over a longer period of time and make it something that's incremental. Augments and conditions are also complicated by the presence of counters. So counters are things that tie into accumulation powers or culmination powers. So whenever you are accumulating effects that necessarily don't kick in until a specific point is reached, like 10 counters on an object, this is another form of condition that's a little bit different. So I'm not sure if augments will end up resting with powers as a form of outcome or condition, if it is a form of outcome, or if it will rest with conditions, or if it will end up its own card class. That's an open question at this stage. But to prohibit some interactions between some of these cards, there's going to be keyword-driven language embedded in the descriptions that will define the more specific classes. So, for instance, there will be like a set of damage cards. There's damage, and then there's damage is a form of power card. So if you have like hydrokinesis would have damage attached to it. And so then you have something like healing. And healing is another form of power, and it's non-damage. So the keyword class damage might be a form of power card. Whereas a healing class of power card might be different. And so you'll find that keyword associations and linkages, for instance, like with a strike action, if you have a strike action, you may have to link a damage power card to that in order to be able to deal your damage. That leads to Misfortune decks. So I've mentioned Misfortune before. I just cursory coverage here. Misfortune deck is a way we treat critical misses. We originally had a form of weapon flaws. I'll be covering that in the next video. But the Misfortune deck strips out the need for all role groupings or weird assignments of flaws during the crafting process. It just creates a deck that essentially has a bunch of really crappy consequences. And when you have a critical miss, you draw one of these consequences. If you decide that you want to improvise, which we will cover very shortly, then you're drawing more misfortune if you miss. So again, just looking at some of the different kind of classes so you can understand what some of these things do. So an example of a prep action, an action card would be the bank action, which is it specifies to take a costed prep action. So it's giving you the guidelines around which the action takes place. The technique modifies. So here we have like when rolling the linked actions damage, it has to be linked to a strike action. So when rolling the linked actions damage and no offhand actions have been taken this turn, you can add +1 intensity. Then we have triggers, which is, when you process HP damage, take the linked action. We have radioactivity damage, which is a form of power card. Over here we have skills. So when you let me use flowering spores as an example. As a costed free action, woodland growth, you place this turn will have woodland growth is an object. When woodland growth, when you place this when you placed this turn, have the disorienting aura and a reach equal to this quarter of this proficiency. So basically what this does is it creates an aura around your woodland growth that causes people to be disoriented. It's a costed free action, so it can happen literally at any time. Finally, we have conditions like confused. So at the start of your turn, you leech 3 intensity ingenuity, and then you have to have a shake off. So you roll a faculty challenge at a challenge rating of 100, and if you're successful, you can remove the condition. At the start of every turn, this is you roll your shake off. Power objects, as I mentioned, flame, which is a 1/1 intangible inert object. Anything passing through the object is going to suffer -3 intensity burning damage. So it's you can see that the idea is that you would take some of these cards and you would assemble these cards in order to be able to create a specific kind of action. So I'm going to use an example of the taxonomy for affliction. If you were to make the affliction action. So the affliction action requires a charge action with a trigger and an ability or an augment. In this case, the augment will be affliction because it's the core power that we're trying to build. So this is going to end up requiring the opportunity, the action, and the augment. The augment requires you to have conditions, so you may attach whatever conditions that you want. So this ends up being a taxonomy of like 4 cards. The link parameter describes what cards are necessary in crafting the action. So this is the link parameter. It's always underneath. So this is the link this opportunity to an action. We have an action here. Link requires a trigger and an ability or augment, which of course is the affliction. So the way that it basically works is you take a costed charge action. In your notes, you assign a number of charges to this power equal to its proficiency. Then you may stack the number of charges if you're casting it a second time. Stacking is when you add more charges to a current stack. When triggered by this action, or by this opportunity card, you may spend 1 charge as a free action and use the linked effect or augment. So in this case, the affliction augment. So when you declare the linked action, in this case, affliction, in your notes, you assign a number of conditions equal to half this proficiency. The turn duration of these effects is equal to the proficiency, and when stacking this augment, you may swap conditions. So what this basically does is you take the charge action, it assigns a bunch of charges, and then it attaches the trigger to the augment, and the augment then can be applied or assigned to an object. So you can afflict a weapon, assign it a bunch of conditions, and then you go into battle, and that weapon is capable of dealing bleed or burn or what have you. When you're going through the process of doing this, when the action is trained, the character has invested the time safely to kind of prepare themselves for the combination of these power components. So training takes time. This is essence cost, right? So let's say, for the sake of argument, that the economy of it will ultimately change. That the cost of each of the cards is 25 each. So we have 1, 2, 3, and a 4th card for the conditions. The character will then spend 100 essence to add this action in its entirety to their action sheet. The 4 matching misfortune, which are indicated on the cards, will then get added to the player's misfortune deck. Actions on the player's action sheet will not force misfortune cards to be drawn, but a critical miss will cause 1 misfortune to be drawn from the player's deck. So there's a possibility of stacking misfortune from multiple powers as well as from weapons that you've made. But the essence cost will be deducted from the character's total, which will cause the character to age and move through their life progression. However, let's say for the sake of argument, you wanted to improvise this action. So a character should be able to improvise this action by taking the cards and making it up on the spot. improvisation is dangerous because you aren't taking the time to fully understand the interactions between these components before using them on the battlefield. If this action was improvised and the character failed, the player would have to process the misfortune indicated on the card. So in this case, the action has 4 cards, so a miss will process all 4 misfortune. By design, even the most basic of actions like strike requires 2 action cards, an action strike and a power, which is going to be its basic damage. This means that every miss has a minimum of 2 misfortune draws. Another improvisation drawback by design is that improvised actions don't require the attack to be a critical miss to draw misfortune. A simple miss will suffice. So this is one of the more complicated actions that you could build. But I think in terms of how it's assembled, it's ultimately going to come down to whether or not the user is capable of, or I should say the player is capable of making sense how these cards ultimately go together, which is why the virtual sheets again. So I see this as being a bit of an issue in terms of the complexity of the game, which goes back to in my game design notes, number 3 of my objectives when building this was to try and make it complex but easily digestible for a beginner. And so what I want to do with a digital sheet is ultimately make all these cards digital so that when we actually are placing the items on the field, when we're placing these cards on the field, the end result, the action that is produced is assembled automatically with a clear description. A description as clear as it was in the base version of the game, where you really didn't have much difficulty in understanding how a power would be used. And it will have all of its attendant-derived stats attached to it. Its proficiency, its intensity, its turn duration, and all those things will be embedded right onto the power because the virtual sheet will reach out, grab all that information, and aggregate it for the player. So the actual process of making powers becomes, it has the intuitiveness of cards, but it has the complexity underneath the hood. And that's really what I want to produce, to be able to create the most accessible, but the most individualistic expression of every character's specific build type. In addition to this, I thought we would cover some of the things that are going to be in the original launch lineup. So as I've mentioned before, intentions are attached to every action. So I've gone through and added some of the intentions in this sheet. This is the way that I've been building because I find it's very quick and easy to throw down information in a PowerPoint. So, running over to this area, we have shot, we have barrage. These are some of the basic actions that are available in the game. Again, only unlocked through your disciplines. So shot, barrage, disarm, a parry action, which is an opportunity action, protect, dodge, akimbo. We might use some of these specific cards for building. Some of them will also be used for building not just powers, but they will also be used for building actions which tie back to weapons, which have a slightly different flow, but ultimately is based on the dependencies that are on those cards. So then we have quite a number of techniques as well. As you can see, techniques are tied. So this is a melee technique. It's linked to grapple. If we find, I think grapple is up here somewhere. If I can find it. Well, why can't I find it? Grapple. So we take a melee action, draw a line to a single target within reach, roll a melee attack. If successful, the target is bound and you are grappling. In this case, the technique that's being attached to it is the and now I need to find the original technique, chokehold. When you are grappling, you can declare this technique and apply suffocate to the bound target. It will enable you not just to bind the target, but also to suffocate them. Then we have quite a number of skills, which include stealth skills, which we haven't covered yet. And what were originally called outcome, now called power cards. There are 4 augments that are going to be available, as well as 10 objects. There's also quite a number of conditions and a small handful of opportunity cards that are available in the base game. At launch, the distribution of cards are going to be a little... they're going to be weighted towards certain intentions. So there's a total of 226 cards that have been made for the launch. They're all available through the disciplines that I've shown you. There are 49 actions, 39 techniques, 88 skills, 10 objects, 4 augments, 18 powers, 12 conditions, and 7 opportunities. The way that they're broken down by intention is I've prioritized basically preservation and annihilation, which I think are the most accessible for most players. Will each get 14 cards. The charity option will have 12, mastery will have 13, and enforcement will have 10. The ones that will be in the lower kind of strata of utility will be craving, invention, change, and authority. Authority will get an update fairly early on when I expand speech and control actions. Change is one of the more difficult ones to build out. Invention is actually a little deceiving in that it may seem like there's not very many available cards from the beginning, but one of the actions that a person can take is to forge, which ultimately forge and reforge, the crafting mechanic itself for creating weapons and armor, will trigger invention. So that may actually be more accessible than players might necessarily think from the beginning. Also, those types of actions will be tied to things like rapid field assembly of things like mounted weapons and stuff. So when you get into things like machinery and crafting things like mounted weapons, if you're deploying some drones or something along those lines, then pretty much guaranteed that every game you're going to set up and take down an object. So that's at least 2 examples or 2 uses of the invention powers. Of course, there are other options that are available. Craving is definitely the one that gets the least, but pyrokinesis is embedded in the game. So you will get pyrokinetic power, which ultimately means that whenever you're using a pyrokinetic attack, you're going to be able to tap into craving. Similarly, what you will find is a character who is using transformation or charge powers. Charge powers are typically connected with things like augmentation or transformation with self-body change. There's also the application of a shroud to create auras. This is, again, another charge action. So people who are into the kind of the blade singers who are a form of like sword mage or battle mage, they might have better access to change. So really at this point, the most limited of all of the sets is authority, which is why I'm tackling it first with the speech action growth. And then we'll see how this kind of develops. But this is generally how the way that powers are being set up. And the roadmap forward will be right from the get-go to build a really coherent and complete version of the card mechanic, and then to play it through and make sure that it's producing things that people can digest and understand. This is the number one thing that we have to do. And then down the road, converting many cards to be able to fit within the system. So that's everything for action training. In the next video, I'm going to try and cover the way that crafting works, and then we'll tie back into action training for weapons.